The studio was bright and colorful. Special lights made everything look warm and welcoming. The audience was full of fans and people who were excited to watch. Some held up signs, while others just stared at the big red curtain that covered the stage. The room was filled with the sound of people talking and the soft noises of the crew getting everything ready. Everything worked smoothly like a well-run machine. At the center of the stage, there was a big black leather chair for the host. Next to it were two stylish chairs for the special guests of the night, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock. A huge screen in the background showed the name of the show in big, bright letters. Everything was planned perfectly to make the show look amazing. Backstage, Keanu and Sandra were getting ready to go out. They spoke quietly to each other, offering comfort like old friends. Keanu wore a simple black suit over a dark t-shirt. He looked calm but powerful like he always did. Sandra wore a beautiful navy blue dress that made her eyes stand out. She smiled, but there was a tiny bit of nervousness in her face. "It's going to be okay," Sandra whispered, fixing her dress. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "You think so?" he said softly. They both knew this wouldn't be a normal interview. The host was known for asking tough questions. She didn't mind making her guests feel uncomfortable. People watched her show because she got celebrities to say things they usually wouldn't. On the other side of the stage, the woman who would be asking them questions held her note cards tightly. Her eyes were sharp like she could see everything. She wore a perfect beige suit and stood tall with confidence. Her name was Margaret Hawthorne. She was a famous journalist, fearless and sometimes harsh. Her show was not about making people feel good. It was about finding secrets, creating tension, and sometimes even making people cry. The show's theme music started playing, and the audience clapped and cheered loudly. The show had begun. "Good evening, everyone," Margaret said with a big smile. Her voice was welcoming, but there was something behind it, something careful and planned. "Tonight, we have a special treat for you. 2 stars, 2 Hollywood legends, together once again. This will be a conversation you won't forget." The crowd got even louder. Some held up signs saying things like, "Speed was my childhood," and "Keanu, marry me." The excitement in the room was real. "Now let's welcome our guests, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock," Margaret announced. The red curtain opened, and the 2 stars walked onto the stage, smiling and waving at the crowd. Keanu gave a small, cool nod, thanking the audience silently. Sandra always glowing blew kisses to the fans. The studio was full of cheers. The energy was strong. They sat down in their chairs, still smiling, while Margaret watched them closely. She noticed every little thing, how Keanu sat relaxed, how Sandra tucked her hair behind her ear. Small details, tiny movements, things she could use later in the interview. The cheering slowly faded and silence filled the room. The audience was ready. Margaret held her note cards and smirked slightly. She glanced at Keanu and Sandra like a cat watching mice. "Welcome to the show," she said smoothly. "Thanks for having us," Sandra said, crossing her legs with grace. "It's great to be here," Keanu added in his usual calm way. Margaret tilted her head slightly, still smiling. "I think we can all agree, it's amazing to see you two together again. You both have had long careers, so much success, so many challenges, and, of course, a few controversies." She paused, letting the word controversies hang in the air like a secret. The audience reacted, some whispering, some laughing nervously. They could feel something was coming. Sandra and Keanu exchanged a quick look. Just a second. But Margaret noticed it. "But before we get into that," Margaret continued, flipping through her note cards, "let's start with something simple." She lifted her eyes and stared at them. "What does it mean to be Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock today?" Keanu smiled slightly and leaned forward. The question seemed easy, but there was something tricky about the way she asked it. This was just the beginning of her game. Sandra took a deep breath before answering. She knew she had to be careful with her words. "It means staying true to who we are, even in a world that tries to change us." Keanu nodded. "It also means appreciating the journey. We've grown and changed, but deep down, we are still the same people who started all those years ago." The audience clapped. It was a safe but honest answer. But Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. She turned another note card over, acting as if she was really thinking about their words. "Interesting," she said, dragging out the silence for a little too long. Then she asked, "But did you really have control over your careers?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes shining like she was playing a game. "Or were you just puppets of Hollywood, taking whatever roles they gave you with no real choice?" The studio went quiet. No more murmurs. No more nervous laughter. That question was not just bold, it was an attack. Sandra blinked, surprised for a moment, but quickly hid it. Keanu, on the other hand, didn't react at all. He just watched Margaret like a chess player waiting for the right move. Margaret didn't stop. She pressed forward. Let's talk about you, Keanu. You were one of the biggest action stars of the 90s. Then you disappeared for a while. You only came back with John Wick. Was that your choice? Or just luck? What happened in between? Keanu didn't answer right away. He knew one wrong word could change everything. Like everyone, I went through different times in my life, he said finally, his voice calm. Not everything follows a perfect plan. Sometimes we make choices and sometimes opportunities come our way and we decide whether to take them. Margaret wasn't satisfied. So, in other words, sometimes you took roles you didn't really want? Sandra chuckled softly, but there was something serious behind her laughter. That happens to every actor. The perfect project doesn't always come at the perfect time. But every role teaches you something. Margaret narrowed her eyes. So, Sandra, you've taken roles you hated? The audience murmured again. The question was sharp, impossible to ignore. Sandra kept her smile, but her eyes hardened just a little. I've taken roles that, looking back, I might not do again. But hate? No. Every role has led me here. It's all part of the journey. Margaret smirked. That sounds like a practiced answer. The room fell even quieter. Keanu leaned forward slightly. His body still looked relaxed, but his energy had changed. What exactly were you hoping to hear, Margaret? For the first time that night, Margaret seemed caught off guard. She blinked but quickly recovered, flashing another smile. Just a little more honesty, Keanu. Keanu smiled back, but his eyes didn't waver. Honesty doesn't need to be dramatic to be true. A whisper moved through the audience. Keanu had just turned the tables. At least for now. But Margaret wasn't someone who liked to lose. She picked up a new card. This time her face changed. All right, Margaret said. If we're talking about honesty, let's really talk about it. She turned to Sandra, her eyes shining with excitement. Many people say you could have been the greatest actress of your time, Margaret said. But instead you chose easy, happy movies and safe roles. Do you wish you had taken bigger risks? This question was sharp. It didn't just ask about Sandra's career. It made it sound like she wasn't good enough to do serious movies. Sandra blinked fast. Keanu looked at her but barely moved. This was an important moment. Sandra took a deep breath and waited just a second before speaking. That's interesting, she said. Because I never thought of my career that way. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You didn't? Sandra smiled. But this time it was a different kind of smile. People think taking risks means choosing dark, serious movies, Sandra said. But I chose to make movies that made people happy. Isn't that a risk too? Creating something good without making it sad or mean. You think that's easy? I think that's one of the hardest things an artist can do. The audience clapped. It was a smart and strong answer. But Margaret wasn't giving up. She picked up another card and her face changed again. This time she turned to Keanu. And you, Keanu, she said, her voice softer now, like she was about to ask something personal. Have you ever regretted saying yes to something? Or saying no? Sandra turned to look at Keanu. He didn't answer right away. Margaret had asked the question in a way that made it sound like she knew something secret. Keanu took a slow breath. Every choice I've made has led me to this moment, he said. It sounded simple, but the air in the room felt heavy. Margaret looked straight at him. She didn't look away. Even the choices that made you lose something important? She asked. The whole room went silent. Now the question was serious. It wasn't just a tricky question. It was personal. Keanu stayed still. His deep eyes locked onto Margaret's. The whole studio was holding its breath. Sandra's body tensed. She knew this was dangerous. And she knew that Margaret knew it too. Keanu took a deep breath. Life isn't just about work, Margaret, he said, his voice calm but strong. Sometimes the choices we make, or the choices we have to make, change who we are. But that doesn't mean we regret them. Margaret tilted her head. She pretended to think about his words. So you've never had regrets? She asked. Keanu paused. His jaw tightened just a little. I would only regret not living, he said. Not doing things because I was afraid of what could have happened. The audience had been completely silent. But now they started clapping. Margaret still wasn't done. She picked up another card. She looked at Keanu again. Keanu, your life has had a lot of sad moments, she said. You've lost people you loved. You've had hard times. And yet you always seem calm. People see you as someone who never gets upset, almost like a wise monk. Sandra could see the trap Margaret was setting. She wanted Keanu to show weakness, to get emotional for the cameras. Keanu put his hands on his knees. He didn't blink. Pain is part of life, he said. Sandra felt a chill. Keanu almost never talked about his personal life. I'm just like everyone else, he continued. We all feel sad sometimes. But what matters isn't the pain, it's what we do with it. His words were so honest that even Margaret hesitated for a second. But only for a second. Then she turned to Sandra. And you, Sandra, she said. You've played characters who find love in movies. But in real life you never found someone who stayed with you. Why? The audience gasped. The question was mean. And everyone knew it. Keanu looked at Sandra, giving her silent support. Sandra blinked a few times. Then she let out a small laugh. But this laugh was different. Low, quiet, and filled with something Margaret didn't expect. You know, Margaret, Sandra said, her voice soft but steady. Sometimes a question tells more about the person asking than the person answering. Margaret blinked. She didn't see that coming. But Sandra wasn't done. I did find someone, she said. The room went silent. Sandra almost never talked about her private life. Someone who loved me just as I am, she said. Who made me laugh. Who shared his life with me. Who gave me a family. She took a deep breath. And he's gone. The studio was completely still. Margaret realized too late that she had made a mistake. Daniel Mercer wasn't just my partner, Sandra said. He was my home. And just because someone isn't here anymore doesn't mean the love disappears. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Margaret didn't know what to say. Keanu looked at Sandra. And without a word, he placed his hand over hers. It was small. But it was powerful. No words were needed. After a few seconds, Sandra took a deep breath and sat up straight again. I have lived in love, she said. And it's still with me. Does that answer your question? The audience clapped loudly. For the first time that night, Margaret looked nervous. She glanced down at her cards. She realized that she had lost control of the interview. Sandra and Keanu weren't just defending themselves. They were winning. Margaret swallowed. She picked up her last card. If she had any chance of taking control back, this was her last shot. She lifted her eyes, this time not smiling. Keanu, she said, there's something you've never talked about in public. Something that could change the way everyone here sees you. Keanu said nothing. He just waited. Are you ready to finally tell the truth? The studio went silent. Sandra shifted in her chair. She felt something was wrong. The game wasn't over yet. And Margaret was about to play her final card. Sandra Bullock shifted in her seat, her eyes glancing at Keanu. She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she could feel the air getting tense. Keanu, however, sat still, his face showing no emotion. Are you ready to tell the truth now? Margaret asked. Her voice sounded like she knew something important. The audience sat in complete silence. Everyone was waiting, expecting something big. Keanu let out a slow breath through his nose. Then at last he spoke. What truth are you talking about, Margaret? It was a simple question, but it changed everything. Now she had to explain what she meant. Margaret hesitated for just a second, then looked down at her cards as if she was thinking carefully about her next words. For years people have admired you, she said. They love your kindness, your calmness, and your humility. But some people wonder, how much of that is real? Is Keanu Reeves truly the good guy everyone thinks he is, or is it just an act? The audience gasped. It wasn't a shocking secret, but it was still a bold thing to say. Sandra narrowed her eyes. She understood now. Margaret wasn't trying to expose some terrible truth about Keanu. She was trying to make people doubt who he really was. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his face unreadable. Then he did something no one expected. He smiled. Not a forced smile. Not a nervous smile. A real, quiet, almost amused smile. I see, he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. So, what's your answer, Keanu? He leaned back in his chair, staying calm. If I were pretending, Margaret, I think I'd be really bad at it. Because the truth is, I'm just a guy. A guy who makes mistakes. A guy who has regrets. A guy who sometimes gets angry, sad, or frustrated, just like everyone else. The audience stayed silent, listening closely. The only difference is, Keanu continued, I don't feel the need to show those moments just to prove I'm human. Sandra felt something in her chest, a mix of pride and admiration. Keanu turned slightly to the audience. I am not immune to life, Margaret. No one is. But I choose what parts of myself I share with the world. Not because I'm hiding anything, but because some things don't have to be public to be real. A wave of applause filled the room. It wasn't just polite clapping. It was real respect. Margaret tapped her cards against the table, pressing her lips together. She had lost this round. Sandra saw the moment and decided to speak. She turned to Margaret, crossing one leg over the other. "Let me ask you something, Margaret." The host blinked, surprised. This was not how things were supposed to go. "You have built a career on making people reveal things they don't want to," Sandra continued. "You love tension. You love pushing buttons. But have you ever asked yourself why?" The audience let out a collective gasp. No one had ever turned the question back on Margaret before. For the first time that night, Margaret looked uncomfortable. "That's not what this is about, Sandra." Sandra tilted her head, her gaze sharp. "Isn't it?" Margaret opened her mouth, but no words came out. Keanu, still calm, decided to finish it. "People don't remember us just for the movies we make, Margaret. They remember us for how we make them feel." Silence. Then the audience erupted into loud applause. Margaret exhaled and tightened her grip on her cue cards. She had lost. Completely. Sandra turned to Keanu, grinning. "That was fun." Keanu chuckled softly. "You have a strange idea of fun." Margaret, regaining some of her confidence, forced a smile. "Well, that was an interesting conversation." She turned to the cameras, ending the segment. Keanu Reeves, Sandra Bullock. Two legends who are still here, still inspiring, and still full of surprises. The audience stood up, clapping loudly. As the cameras cut off, Margaret looked at Keanu and Sandra with something new in her eyes. Respect. Maybe even a little admiration. "I have to admit," she said softly, "I didn't expect you two to handle things the way you did." Sandra smirked. "Neither did you, apparently." Margaret let out a small laugh. "Touché." Keanu simply nodded and stood up. He extended his hand. Margaret hesitated, then shook it. "No hard feelings?" she asked. Keanu smiled slightly. "No expectations." And with that, he and Sandra walked off the stage. The interview was over, but Keanu and Sandra weren't in a hurry to leave. They sat in the dressing room, unwinding after the intense conversation. Sandra kicked off her heels and sighed. "Well, that was fun." Keanu smirked. "You really do have a strange idea of fun." She laughed, then looked at him. "I meant what I said, you know. About us being family." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, I know." Sandra smiled. "It's weird, right? How we've known each other for so long but never worked together again after Speed? Except for the lake house." Keanu shrugged. "Timing is funny like that." Sandra chuckled. "Or maybe you were avoiding me." Keanu smirked. "I think you were avoiding me." She laughed, shaking her head. "You know, back then I had the biggest crush on you." Keanu blinked. "Really?" Sandra grinned. "Yeah, but you never made a move." Keanu tilted his head. "Did you want me to?" She thought about it for a second, then smiled. "Nah, I think we were always meant to be what we are. Something better than that." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, we were." A comfortable silence filled the room. Then Sandra sighed. "I'm glad you were there today." Keanu met her eyes. "Always." She hesitated. "You get it, don't you?" "Wasp. Grief. Moving forward." Keanu exhaled. "Yeah, I do." Sandra reached for his hand and gave it a quick squeeze. "Thanks for that." Keanu just nodded. Then, with a grin, she sat up. "Okay, enough serious talk. Let's do something crazy." Keanu smirked. "Like what?" Sandra tapped her chin. "Let's open a bar." Keanu laughed. "A bar?" "Yeah. We'll call it the Speed Stop. All drinks come with countdowns. Stressful but fun." Keanu chuckled. "That sounds like a terrible idea." Sandra grinned. "Exactly. That's why we have to do it." Keanu shook his head, smiling. "You always know how to lighten the mood." Sandra nudged him playfully. "That's what best friends do, right?" Keanu's expression softened. "Yeah, that's what best friends do." She stretched her arms. "Okay, enough talk. I'm starving. Burgers?" Keanu smirked. "Burgers?" Sandra hooked her arm through his as they walked toward the exit. No cameras. No spotlight. Just two friends still standing, still connected. And in the end, that was all that mattered. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world, and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.